The morning air was cold and still. London stood quiet under a gray November sky. No birds sang. No cars honked. Just silence, deep and heavy. Like the city itself was holding its breath at the edge of the parade ground. Princess Catherine stood alone in black. Her coat was buttoned to the chin. Her hat cast a shadow over her eyes. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She only stared ahead at the rows of guards forming in perfect lines. Today was not a celebration. It was Remembrance Day, a day to honor the soldiers who never came home. And this year Catherine would walk with them, not behind them, not beside them. With them, no one had expected it. No one had asked for it. But she insisted. Before we continue, if you love stories that move the heart and show the strength of the human spirit, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Catherine had been quiet for weeks. Ever since her illness, ever since the treatment, the palace said she was recovering. The press said she looked tired, but no one knew what she was really feeling. No one knew what it cost her just to stand, and now she was here. The commander of the Queen's Guard approached her slowly. His boots crunched against the gravel. He saluted, his face unreadable. "Your Royal Highness," he said. "The formation is ready. Are you certain you wish to proceed?" Catherine's lips pressed together. She nodded once. The commander hesitated. "It's a long march, ma'am, and the ceremony. It can be overwhelming." "I know," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, but it didn't shake. "That's why I need to be there." He studied her for a moment. Then he stepped back and saluted again. "As you wish, Your Highness." The drums began. Low and steady. Boom, boom. The sound echoed across the square like a heartbeat. The guards began to move, their boots striking the ground in perfect unison. Catherine took her place among them. She didn't walk in front. She didn't walk behind. She walked in the center, surrounded by soldiers twice her size. But she didn't look small. She looked strong. The crowd lining the streets watched in silence. Some held flowers. Some held photos of loved ones lost in war. A few wiped tears from their faces. No one cheered. No one clapped. They just watched, because this wasn't about royalty. This wasn't about titles or crowns. This was about sacrifice. This was about remembering, and Catherine, fragile, recovering. Still fighting her own battle, was marching for those who couldn't. But as the parade turned toward the war memorial, something unexpected happened. Something no one had prepared for. A woman broke through the barrier. Security moved instantly. Two officers lunged forward, hands reaching for the woman. But Catherine raised her hand. "Wait," she said. The guards froze. The drums stopped. Everyone stopped. The woman stood in the street, trembling. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her coat was worn and faded. In her hands, she clutched a small photograph. Tears streamed down her face. Catherine stepped forward slowly. The guards shifted, unsure. The commander tensed, but Catherine didn't stop. She walked right up to the woman. "It's all right," Catherine said gently. "What's your name?" The woman's voice cracked. "Margaret." Catherine nodded. "Hello, Margaret." Margaret's hand shook as she held up the photograph. It was black and white, creased and yellowed with age. A young man in uniform smiled back from the frame. "He couldn't have been more than 20, my son," Margaret whispered. "He died in Afghanistan 12 years ago." Catherine looked at the photo for a long moment. Then she looked back at Margaret. "What was his name?" "James," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "His name was James." Catherine reached out and gently touched the edge of the photograph. "James was brave," she said softly, "and he's not forgotten." Margaret's face crumpled. She started to sob, her whole body shaking. Without hesitation, Catherine stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the woman. The crowd gasped. A royal, embracing a stranger in the middle of a ceremony. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't planned. But it was real. Catherine held Margaret while she cried. She didn't rush her. She didn't pull away. She just stood there in the middle of the street, holding a grieving mother who had lost everything. The guard stood still. The crowd watched in silence, and somewhere in the distance, a bell began to toll. When Margaret finally pulled back, her eyes were red and swollen. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing him. For seeing us." Catherine smiled softly. "I see you. I see all of you." Security gently guided Margaret back to the crowd. But before she left, she turned and looked at Catherine one more time. And for the first time in years, there was peace in her eyes. The drums started again. The march continued, but something had shifted. The ceremony wasn't just tradition anymore. It wasn't just duty. It was personal. Catherine walked on, her head high, her steps steady. But inside, her heart was breaking, because she knew what it meant to fight. She knew what it meant to be afraid. She knew what it meant to wonder if you'd ever be strong again, and she carried that with her. Step after step, all the way to the memorial. When they finally arrived, the cenotaph stood tall and solemn, covered in wreaths of red poppies. The names of the fallen were carved into the stone, thousands of them. Stretching back over a century, Catherine placed her wreath carefully at the base. She bowed her head, and for 2 full minutes, the entire city fell silent. But just as the silence was about to break, someone in the crowd began to clap. It started with 1 person, then 2, then 10, then 100. The applause spread through the crowd like a wave, growing louder and louder. It wasn't celebratory. It wasn't joyful. It was something else. Something deeper. It was gratitude. Catherine stood still, her head still bowed. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge the applause. She just stood there, honoring the names on the wall, but the clapping didn't stop. It grew stronger. People were crying. Veterans saluted. Children held their parents' hands and watched in silence. And in that moment, something powerful happened. The ceremony stopped being about 1 person. It stopped being about royalty or status. It became about everyone. About every soldier who had served, every family who had lost someone, every person who had ever known what it meant to sacrifice. Catherine had reminded them of that, not with words, but with presence. When the silence finally returned, Catherine stepped back. She nodded to the commander, and the march resumed. But this time, something had changed. The guards weren't just marching for tradition. They were marching for the people. For the mothers like Margaret, for the sons like James, and Catherine was marching with them. The procession moved slowly through the streets, past the crowd, past the monuments, past the flags flying at half-mast. And with every step, Catherine felt the weight of it all. The grief, the pride, the pain. But she didn't stop. She couldn't, because this wasn't about her. It never had been. They reached Buckingham Palace just as the sun broke through the clouds. The golden light spilled over the courtyard, casting long shadows across the stone. The guards came to a halt. The ceremony was over, but Catherine didn't leave right away. She stood at the top of the steps, looking out over the people still gathered below. They were silent now, watching her, waiting, and then, without a word, she placed her hand over her heart. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything. The crowd responded in kind. Hands over hearts. Heads bowed. A shared moment of understanding. Catherine turned and walked inside. The doors closed behind her. The ceremony was over, but the story wasn't. Because that night, as the palace grew quiet and the city went to sleep, Catherine sat alone in her room. She stared at the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She thought about Margaret, about James, about all the people she had met that day, all the lives that had been lost, all the grief that still remained. And she thought about her own battle, the one she was still fighting, the one no one could see for months. She had been in treatment, chemotherapy, radiation, the kind of fight that leaves you exhausted and afraid, the kind of fight where you wonder if you'll ever feel like yourself again. But today, she had marched. She had stood with soldiers and families and strangers. She had honored the fallen. And in doing so, she had reminded herself of something important. Strength isn't about never being weak. It's about showing up anyway. Catherine closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow, she would rest. But today, she had done enough. She had shown the world what courage really looks like. And somewhere in London, Margaret sat in her small apartment, holding the photograph of her son. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. The next morning, the newspapers were everywhere. Princess Kate breaks protocol to comfort grieving mother. Moment of grace. Catherine's emotional tribute, the princess who marched with heroes. The photos were on every front page. Catherine in black, standing among the guards. Catherine embracing Margaret. Catherine with her hand over her heart. People couldn't stop talking about it. It's not just in England, but around the world. Social media exploded. Videos of the moment went viral. Comments poured in by the thousands. I cried watching this. She didn't have to do that. But she did. This is what real leadership looks like. But inside the palace, things were different. Catherine sat at the breakfast table, staring at the headlines. Her tea had gone cold. She hadn't touched her food. She just sat there, reading the words, over and over again. Prince William entered the room quietly. He saw her face and knew immediately. You all right? He asked, sitting down beside her. Catherine didn't answer right away. She folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside. I didn't do it for this, she said quietly. I didn't do it for the headlines. I know, William said. Ack! But that doesn't make it any less important. Catherine shook her head. It feels wrong. They're making it about me. But it wasn't about me. It was about them, about the soldiers, about the families. William reached over and took her hand. You gave them something they needed. You reminded them that their grief matters. Their sacrifices aren't forgotten. That's not nothing, Catherine. She looked at him, her eyes tired. But I'm just one person. What difference does it really make? William smiled softly, asked Margaret. Catherine's breath caught. She looked down at the table, her throat tight. Because he was right. She had seen it in Margaret's eyes. The relief, the gratitude, the feeling of being seen. And maybe that was enough. Later that day, Catherine received a letter. It arrived by hand, delivered to the palace gates by a woman who refused to give her name. The envelope was simple, with no return address. Inside was a single handwritten note. Your Royal Highness, thank you for yesterday. My son James would have been proud to see you march. I know I was. You didn't just honor the fallen, you honored the living. You reminded us that grief doesn't make us weak, it makes us human. You are stronger than you know. With deepest gratitude, Margaret, Catherine read the letter 3 times, and she folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't need the headlines. She didn't need the praise. She just needed to know that it mattered, and now she did. That evening, Catherine received a call from a hospital in Manchester. A young veteran named David had been watching the ceremony on television. He'd been struggling. Depression, PTSD. He hadn't left his house in weeks. But after seeing Catherine march, something shifted. He called the hospital. He asked for help. He took the first step toward healing. The nurses wanted Catherine to know. They thought she should hear what her actions had done. When William told her, Catherine sat down slowly. She covered her mouth with her hand. Tears filled her eyes. I had no idea, she whispered. You never do, William said gently. But that's the point. You show up. You do what's right. The rest follows. Catherine nodded, wiping her eyes. She didn't feel strong. She didn't feel brave. She just felt like someone trying her best. But maybe that was what bravery really was. That night, Catherine stood at the window again, looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, Margaret was sleeping peacefully. David was beginning his recovery. Families were remembering their loved ones with a little less pain. Catherine, still healing, still fighting, had reminded the world of something they'd forgotten. That compassion is powerful. That presence matters. That even in silence we can speak volumes. She pressed her hand to the glass and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would rest. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel it. the weight, the gratitude, the quiet pride. She had marched with heroes, and in doing so, she had become one herself. 3 days later, Catherine received another letter. This one was different. It came in a large envelope, postmarked from Edinburgh. Inside were dozens of smaller letters, all addressed to her. They were from soldiers, active duty, veterans, families of the fallen. Each one told a story. A mother whose son had died in Iraq, a father who had lost his daughter in a training accident, a young soldier who had lost both legs in combat and was learning to walk again. They all had one thing in common. They had all seen the ceremony. They had all watched Catherine march. And they had all felt something they hadn't felt in years. Hope. Catherine sat in her private sitting room and read every single letter. She didn't rush. She didn't skim. She gave each one her full attention. One letter stood out. It was written in shaky handwriting, the kind that comes from age or emotion. It was from a man named Robert, a veteran of the Falklands War. Your Royal Highness, I have not cried in 40 years. Not since I came home from the Falklands, not at my wife's funeral, not at my daughter's wedding. I learned to lock it away, to be strong, to never break. But when I saw you stop for that woman, when I saw you hold her while she cried, something inside me broke open. And for the first time in decades, I let myself feel it. The grief, the loss, the pain I've been carrying all these years. You gave me permission to be human again. Thank you, Robert. Catherine set the letter down carefully. Her hands were shaking. She stared at the words, reading them again and again. She had spent so long worrying about whether she was strong enough, whether she was brave enough, whether she was doing enough. But these letters told her something different. They told her that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about being willing to break in front of others, to show that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's courage. Catherine folded the letter and placed it with Margaret's. Then she stood and walked to her desk. She pulled out a piece of stationery and began to write. She wrote back to Robert. She wrote back to Margaret. She wrote back to as many people as she could. Not long responses, just a few words, but words that mattered. Thank you for sharing your story. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. She signed each one personally. She made sure every single letter was sent, because if there was one thing she had learned, it was this: small acts of kindness can change everything. The weeks that followed were quiet. Catherine stayed out of the public eye, focusing on her recovery. She rested. She spent time with her family. She allowed herself to heal. But the impact of that one day continued to ripple outward. A charity for veterans saw a 300% increase in donations. Mental health hotlines reported record numbers of soldiers reaching out for help. Remembrance Day services around the country saw the largest attendance in decades. And in homes across the nation, families began to talk about loss, about grief, about the people they had loved and lost. Catherine had opened a door, and people were finally willing to walk through it. One afternoon, William found Catherine in the garden. She was sitting on a bench, wrapped in a blanket, watching the autumn leaves fall. You did something remarkable, he said, sitting beside her. Catherine shook her head. I just did what felt right. That's what makes it remarkable, William said. You didn't do it for recognition. You didn't do it for the press. You did it because you cared. Catherine looked at him. Do you think it made a difference? William smiled. I know it did. Catherine nodded slowly. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked up at the sky. The clouds were clearing. The sun was beginning to break through. She thought about Margaret, about Robert, about David, about all the people who had reached out, who had shared their pain, who had found the courage to heal. And she realized something. She hadn't just marched for them. They had marched for her too. Because healing is never a solo journey. It's something we do together. Catherine took a deep breath and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. 6 months later, Catherine stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the collar of her coat. It was spring now. The world outside was blooming. The gray skies of November had given way to blue. The cold had softened into warmth, and Catherine finally had begun to heal. She was scheduled to attend a ceremony today. Not a march, Not a parade, a dedication. A new memorial garden for veterans and their families. A place where people could come to remember, to grieve, to find peace, and Catherine had been asked to open it. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked different now, healthier, stronger, but also softer somehow. Like the hardness she had been carrying had finally melted away. William appeared in the doorway. "Ready?" Catherine nodded. "I think so." They drove to the memorial together. The gardens were beautiful. Rows of flowers in every color, stone pathways winding between trees, benches with plaques honoring the fallen, and in the center, a fountain. Simple and elegant, with water flowing gently over smooth stones, peaceful. Catherine walked through the gardens slowly, taking it all in. Families were already there, placing flowers, reading names, holding each other close, and then she saw her. Margaret, the older woman, was standing by the fountain, looking down at a plaque. Catherine approached quietly. "Hello, Margaret." Margaret turned, and her face lit up. "Your Highness." She reached out and took Catherine's hand. "I didn't know if you'd be here." "I wouldn't miss it," Catherine said. Margaret smiled, tears in her eyes. "James would have loved this place." Catherine looked down at the plaque. James's name was there, engraved in the stone, along with thousands of others. "He's remembered," Catherine said softly. "They all are," Margaret nodded. "Because of you?" Catherine shook her head. "No, because of people like you. People who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten." "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Catherine hugged her, just like she had that day in November. And this time, there were no cameras. No crowds. Just two women holding each other in a garden of remembrance. When the ceremony began, Catherine gave a short speech. She didn't talk about herself. She didn't talk about the march. She talked about the people, the families, the soldiers, the ones who had sacrificed everything. And when she finished, the crowd stood and applauded. Not for her, but for everyone they had lost, for everyone they still carried in their hearts. As the ceremony ended, a young boy approached Catherine. He couldn't have been more than 7. He held a small poppy in his hand. "Is this for the soldiers?" he asked shyly. Catherine knelt down to his level. "It is." "My grandpa was a soldier," the boy said. "I never met him. But my mom says he was brave." Catherine smiled gently. "I'm sure he was, and I'm sure he would be very proud of you." The boy handed her the poppy. "Can you put this by the fountain? For him?" Catherine took the flower carefully. "I would be honored." She walked to the fountain with the boy and placed the poppy on the edge of the water. It floated gently, carried by the current. The boy watched it for a moment. Then he looked up at Catherine. "Do you think he can see it?" Catherine's throat tightened. She placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I think he can. And I think he's very happy." The boy smiled. Then he ran back to his mother. Catherine stayed by the fountain for a long time. She watched the poppy drift across the water, slow and peaceful. And she thought about everything that had happened. Everything she had learned, that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up. That courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about showing up even when you're afraid. That healing isn't something you do alone. It's something you do together. William walked up beside her. "You all right?" Catherine nodded. "I am." And she meant it, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. She was healing. She was whole. She had marched with heroes. She had carried their stories. She had honored their sacrifices, and in doing so, she had found her own strength. The sun set slowly over the memorial garden, casting golden light over the flowers and the stones and the water. Catherine stood there, surrounded by the names of the fallen. And she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Gratitude, not just for surviving, but for the chance to honor those who didn't, for the chance to make a difference, for the chance to remind the world that every life matters, every sacrifice counts, every story deserves to be told. Catherine took one last look at the garden. Then she turned and walked back toward William, her hand reaching for his. Together, they left the memorial. But the impact of that one November day would never leave. It would live on in the hearts of the people she had touched, in the lives she had changed, in the hope she had given, and somewhere, in a place beyond words, the fallen soldiers watched. And they knew they were not forgotten. They never would be.